This story takes us back to the early days of Georgia's colony, around 1733, and into a particularly turbulent period around 1742. At this time, Spanish forces stationed in Florida threatened Georgia's settlers, aiming to force them out of the new territory. Yet, the colony's diverse settlers, including the English, Scots, and Germans, found an unexpected ally in the Creek Indians. Together, they stood their ground against the Spanish forces, facing the invasion with resilience. Adding intrigue to this time of war and alliance, there was also a plot against the colony's leader, Governor James Oglethorpe. These events, taken from the history of Georgia from its earliest settlement to the present time by Timothy Shea Arthur and William Henry Carpenter, published in 1852, capture the intensity of survival and unity among the settlers. In February 1736, Oglethorpe's presence alone eased tensions within the colony, strengthening it against the looming Spanish threat. The settlers were beginning to develop a robust defense, and as their power grew, so did Spanish concerns. The Spanish governor of St. Augustine, uneasy with the Georgians' rising confidence, reluctantly entered negotiations with the English settlers. The terms were fair, but Spain's distant leaders were hardly interested in peace. Their mission was to force Britain into abandoning its ambitions in Georgia. This became increasingly evident when the Spanish ambassador in London submitted a formal protest, arguing that Georgia lay within Spain's territories, a claim intended to pressure the British crown into surrender. Hostilities grew as Oglethorpe received a message from the governor of St. Augustine, notifying him that a Spanish commissioner from Havana had arrived to issue demands. The commissioner insisted that the English abandon all land south of St. Helena Sound, asserting Spanish dominion. Despite Oglethorpe's attempts to reason with the commissioner, the conversation turned tense, ending without a resolution. Knowing the colony's defense was precarious, Oglethorpe immediately sailed to England, determined to secure the reinforcements necessary to counter any Spanish advance. Back in England, Oglethorpe faced reluctance. War had yet to be formally declared. However, by late 1737, the trustees recognized that Georgia's situation was deteriorating rapidly. On August 10th, they petitioned for an increase in military support to protect the colony, concerned about the escalating Spanish threat in Florida. Shortly afterward, Oglethorpe was promoted to colonel with a general's rank and assigned as commander-in-chief of South Carolina and Georgia's forces, with orders to raise a regiment as swiftly as possible. He returned to Georgia with the additional troops by September 1738. While Oglethorpe was away, the colony's hardships only deepened. Settlers struggled with unyielding land that resisted cultivation, producing little more than a meager subsistence. Discouraged by their lack of success and attracted by better prospects, many left Georgia for the Carolina side of the river. Fearing the colony's depopulation, local leaders and landholders in Savannah petitioned the trustees for reforms, including clear titles to land and permission to use enslaved labor, which they believed could ease their burdens. However, this request split the community. Industrious German and Highland settlers, loyal to Oglethorpe's vision, refused to support slavery. Instead, they countered with their own petition. The Scots argued that a free man could labor more efficiently than an enslaved person, while the Germans expressed contentment with their current state, strongly opposing the idea of slavery to cultivate rice. Their position exemplified a unique moral stand in the colony's history, one that emphasized community and independence over labor exploitation. This tense and formative period in Georgia's history not only highlights the challenges faced by early settlers, but also their determination to establish a lasting home despite overwhelming adversity and conflicting interests. Through alliances and ideological convictions, they helped lay the foundation of a colony that would one day become integral to America's development. The Highlanders and Germans, recognizing the challenges of their new homeland, advocated for bringing more of their countrymen to Georgia. They envisioned a support network that would not only ease the burden of daily labor during times of peace, but also bolster the colony's defenses in times of conflict. The German settlers, in particular, offered a compelling reflection on the contrast between their homeland and their new life in Georgia. While the climate was indeed hotter than in Germany, it was far more bearable than they had initially feared. They quickly adapted to the routine, working in the cooler hours of the morning and evening, while reserving the hottest parts of the day for indoor tasks. This schedule accommodated both the climate and their productivity, creating a structured, if challenging, rhythm. In Germany, they explained, the harsh winters brought frost and snow, halting fieldwork and slowing their agriculture. Here, they found a distinct advantage. Georgia's milder winter allowed them to labor through the colder months, making way for productive spring planting. Although clearing the forested land of trees, brush, and roots was initially backbreaking work, it became gratifying as the toughest hurdles were overcome. This perspective underscores the settlers' resilience and pragmatism. They embraced the colony's harsh realities and persevered with a sense of purpose and optimism. Georgia's settlers represented two contrasting groups. Those like the Salzburgers and Highlanders, who worked tirelessly and thrived, and others who fell into dissatisfaction, blaming their hardships on the land and climate. The colony's success seemed assured if more settlers shared the dedication of the industrious groups. However, idle influences grew, and despite the trustees' resistance, slavery was eventually introduced. The industrious whites, disheartened by this shift, saw their efforts undermined as labor dynamics changed. Yet, many settlers had valid complaints. The land distributed around Savannah varied greatly in quality. Some plots were fertile, while others were barren, pineland tracts that barely sustained their farmers. Those assigned to work on riverine and swamp areas faced a daunting task, where dense timber required a sizable workforce and substantial time to clear the land. The thick, swampy forest also fostered intermittent fevers, while the heavy, damp air often settled close and stifling, unaffected by sea breezes unable to penetrate the foliage. As years passed without a formal war between England and Spain, tensions simmered over issues like navigation rights and Georgia's southern boundary. British merchants, operating under treaty rights to cut logwood in the Bay of Campeche, soon found themselves entangled in a burgeoning trade with Spain, supplying goods manufactured in England. Alarmed by this unregulated trade, Spain doubled its maritime patrols, seizing vessels suspected of carrying contraband. The Spanish actions, over time, targeted even legitimate traders, prompting Britain to protest Spain's treatment of its merchants, though responses from the Spanish court were evasive and prolonged. This uneasy standoff intensified as Spain increased its military presence in East Florida, alarming officials in Georgia and Carolina. Fearing a looming conflict, Carolina's lieutenant governor informed England of the Spanish fortifications, urging swift action. The Crown, determined to protect its interests, instructed its ambassador in Madrid to seek reparations for trade losses. Spain's proposal for compensation was met with indignation in London, as it included a demand to recall Oglethorpe's settlers from Georgia. When Britain rejected Spain's conditions, preparations for defense accelerated. In September 1738, British warships, Hector and Blandford, arrived with Oglethorpe's regiment, strengthening Georgia's military presence. Oglethorpe established command on Jekyll and Cumberland Islands, where he could monitor Spanish activity closely. Yet even as he fortified his position, Spanish agents sought to exploit the alliance between Oglethorpe and the Creek Indians. They lured some of the Creek to St. Augustine under false pretenses, deceiving them into thinking Oglethorpe was there and offering them gifts. Upon discovering the lie, the Creek felt deeply insulted. Their loyalty to Oglethorpe only strengthened. In these tense years, Georgia's settlers not only defended their territory, but defined it, establishing a resilience and identity that would shape the colony's future. The perseverance and solidarity of settlers like the Highlanders, Germans, and Creek forged a collective spirit, setting Georgia apart as a place of resilience and tenacity amidst external threats and internal challenges. The Spanish governor, trying to cover up his deceit, claimed that General Oglethorpe was ill and resting on a ship in the harbor, inviting the Creek Indian chiefs to meet him there. Suspicious of trickery, the Creek leaders declined, rejected Spanish offers of alliance, and promptly left. On returning to their villages, they found an invitation from Oglethorpe himself, asking them to join him at Frederica. Their loyalty was reignited, and they renewed their treaty with Oglethorpe, their allegiance stronger than ever after the Spanish deception. While Oglethorpe remained vigilant for the colony's safety, he faced growing dissatisfaction among settlers near Savannah. Letters penned under the name Plain Dealer, bold and unfiltered, flooded his desk, and petitions signed by many discontented settlers reached the trustees in London. Their demands were clear. They wanted the freedom to buy slaves, unrestricted access to rum, and clear land ownership rights. Recognizing that unrest would persist until changes were made, the trustees met on March 15, 1739. They addressed one primary concern: allowing settlers without male heirs to bequeath land to daughters or other family members, provided the heir personally claimed the lot within 18 months. Later, they broadened this privilege, permitting settlers to appoint any successor they chose. However, the petition to legalize slavery was denied, largely due to the respectful opposition from the Scotch and German settlers, who maintained their stance against its introduction. Still, rum and other spirits continued to slip through illicit channels, making their way into the colony. Efforts to curb this trade proved inadequate. Even respectable settlers would slip into side rooms to enjoy the forbidden liquor. Oglethorpe, ever watchful, would declare, "Woe to the liquor, if it come to my sight," and any found was quickly disposed of. Oglethorpe's primary objective was to confine Spanish influence south of the St. Johns River, establishing a line of forts from Augusta to the river's mouth. Yet, while fortifying the colony's defenses, he became the target of a deadly conspiracy. Within his regiment, 2 companies from Gibraltar, including men who spoke Spanish, had been stationed on Cumberland Island. Here, they were close enough to interact with Spanish outposts. One soldier, a former member of the Spanish forces, still harbored sympathies for Spain and the Catholic faith. The Spanish soon exploited this, using him to sway several British soldiers into a plot to assassinate Oglethorpe and defect to St. Augustine. The plot was set. On the appointed day, conspirators approached Oglethorpe with unreasonable demands, intending to provoke him. When he refused, as anticipated, one soldier fired his weapon, the blast close enough to singe Oglethorpe's clothing, though the bullet narrowly missed. Another plotter aimed to fire, but found only a flash in the pan. A third attacker drew a blade and lunged. By then, Oglethorpe had unsheathed his sword, skillfully deflecting the blow, while an officer arrived and dispatched the assailant. With their plan thwarted, the remaining mutineers attempted to flee, but were swiftly captured and shackled. A court-martial followed, and the ringleaders were condemned to death by firing squad. Around this time, Spanish agents tried to incite a far more insidious rebellion in South Carolina, targeting the enslaved population. With a white population of only about 5,000 compared to roughly 40,000 enslaved people, the colony was particularly vulnerable. This plan led to the Stono Rebellion, where a group of enslaved people raised a standard, openly declared their defiance, and rampaged through the countryside, destroying homes and killing inhabitants. Their march of destruction might have ended in widespread massacre had it not been for the custom of English settlers carrying firearms to church. Armed churchgoers organized and launched a decisive assault, dispersing or killing the rebels. Alerted to the rebellion in South Carolina, Oglethorpe tightened security in Georgia, detaining any Spanish or enslaved individuals traveling through the colony. Meanwhile, the rift between England and Spain deepened, with war growing inevitable. Peace efforts, including the Convention of Pardo, ended in mutual dissatisfaction, and on October 23, 1739, England formally declared war against Spain, reflecting the swelling indignation and readiness of the British people for conflict. These events marked a critical chapter for Georgia, testing the young colony's resolve against external threats and internal discord. Through these challenges, Oglethorpe and the settlers strengthened the foundations of a colony that would endure, fueled by determination and the steadfast bonds they had forged against formidable odds. Admiral Vernon was dispatched to command a British squadron in the West Indies, tasked with diverting Spanish forces by launching offensives in their territories. In line with this strategy, General Oglethorpe received orders to pressure Spanish-held Florida however possible. With the support of South Carolina authorities, he launched an ambitious attack on St. Augustine. Yet, due to a series of unfortunate setbacks, the expedition ended in failure, and Oglethorpe returned to Frederica on July 10, 1740. The campaign's disappointing outcome invited harsh criticism, as pamphleteers and local commentators accused him of cowardice, tyranny, cruelty, and corruption. These accusations, however, starkly contradicted the essence of Oglethorpe's life, one marked by selfless devotion to his country and faith and care for the less fortunate. He had voluntarily left behind courtly privileges, risking perilous ocean voyages and exposing himself to the same hardships as the settlers. Instead of basking in comfort, he subsisted on boiled rice, moldy bread, and salt pork, often resting on the damp ground under open skies. Despite Oglethorpe's dedication, Georgia's growth lagged behind expectations. By the colony's 8th year, only 1,521 settlers lived there, with 686 fit for military service, despite substantial financial support. The settlement's cost amounted to £112,000, mostly funded by the British Parliament, with a smaller portion from private donations. Settlers who arrived at their own expense were unaccounted for, and Frederica, Oglethorpe's base on St. Simon's Island, embodied the colony's defensive ambitions. Established in 1736 on the island's west side, Frederica rose on a bluff overlooking a navigable river, connected to the Altamaha and reaching the sea through Jekyll Sound. This strategic town featured a robust fort armed with 18-pound cannons, surrounded by stockade earth bastions, a palisade ditch, and fortified ramparts. Inside, 2 large brick and timber buildings supported the fort's defenses. Surrounding the town was a pentagonal rampart and dry ditch, spanning 1.5 miles, with 2 main gates, the town and water posts. Frederica's layout was orderly, with spacious streets named after military officers and lined with orange trees, and a small settlement called St. Simon's lay on the island's southern point. A nearby battery served as a lookout, alerting Frederica's headquarters with signal guns whenever a vessel was sighted. Additional forts and batteries dotted Jekyll Island's northern end, where a brewery served the troops, and stretched south to Cumberland Island and the St. Johns River mouth. This extensive fortification network was completed in just 7 months, underscoring Oglethorpe's tireless commitment to Georgia's defense. As British naval forces engaged Spain's attention in the West Indies, Spanish fleets could not be spared to contest their claim on Georgia's southern territories. However, once Britain's fleet returned to England, Spain seized the opportunity to mobilize against Oglethorpe's settlements. In May 1742, 2,000 Spanish troops under Don Antonio de Redondo sailed from Havana, arriving at St. Augustine. An English cruiser spotted them, alerting Oglethorpe, who swiftly sent a request for reinforcements to Governor Glenn of South Carolina and a messenger to Admiral Vernon in the West Indies. Despite shared stakes in Georgia's protection, Charleston's residents, doubting Oglethorpe's leadership after the St. Augustine failure, refused aid, focusing instead on their town's defenses. Undeterred, Oglethorpe rallied his Creek allies and Highlanders from Darien, led by Captain McIntosh, eager to avenge the fallen at Fort Mose. With these forces and his Frederica regiment, he resolved to hold his ground, anxiously awaiting possible reinforcements. On June 21st, 9 Spanish vessels approached Amelia Sound, but were repelled by Fort William's cannon fire. Oglethorpe, upon learning of the engagement, sent Captain Horton and his grenadiers ahead and personally led a detachment through a gauntlet of Spanish ships at St. Andrew's Sound. Although Lieutenant Tolson, in the most fortified boat, hesitated, jeopardizing the mission, Oglethorpe successfully returned to St. Simon's the next day. By June 28th, a Spanish fleet of 36 ships, carrying over 5,000 soldiers commanded by Don Manuel Montiano, anchored off St. Simon's Bar. After several days spent sounding the channel's depths, they entered on July 5th, only to face fierce resistance from Frederica's batteries and ships. Oglethorpe's men repelled multiple boarding attempts, inflicting heavy casualties on the Spanish. His fortified outpost, along with the loyalty of his allies and the strategic defense of the Altamaha, would become emblematic of the colony's resilience in the face of formidable Spanish opposition. In a fierce 3-hour engagement, Oglethorpe's forces inflicted a significant toll on the Spanish, killing 17 and wounding 10. Yet undeterred, the Spanish fleet moved a mile further along the island, raising their red flag and deploying their forces. They established a fortified battery of 20 18-pounders and brought a well-equipped artillery regiment under Don Antonio de Redondo, alongside a regiment of black soldiers. These black commanders, clothed in lace and sharing ranks with white officers, conversed openly with the Spanish command, reflecting Spain's distinctive military inclusivity. Seeing that his artillery was ineffective against this encampment, Oglethorpe spiked his guns, destroyed his remaining supplies, and withdrew to Frederica, where he decided to make his defensive stand. Outnumbered and surrounded by a vastly superior force, Oglethorpe deployed scouting parties to observe and harass the enemy, while his main force fortified Frederica as best as possible. To inspire his men, who numbered fewer than 700, he endured the same hardships as they did, sharing their fatigue and dangers. The Spanish, meanwhile, struggled to push through Georgia's marshy and densely wooded terrain, where deep morasses and dark thickets, guarded by Creek warriors and Highlanders, repelled every attempt they made to advance. On July 7th, Oglethorpe learned that a Spanish detachment had moved within 2 miles of Frederica. He quickly assembled 4 platoons, joined by Highlanders, Rangers, and Creek allies, and launched a sudden assault, pushing the Spanish back with a loss of 129 men killed or captured. After chasing the retreating enemy for 2 miles, he paused and positioned his forces strategically, placing Highlanders in a wooded area with an open savanna between them and the Spanish path to Frederica. As he returned to Frederica to organize reinforcements, 300 Spanish soldiers launched an attack on his ambush site. Rushing back to the scene, Oglethorpe rallied 3 retreating platoons, led them to support the steadfast Highlanders, and managed to secure another victory, with the Spanish forced to retreat. Among the casualties was Don Antonio de Barba, mortally wounded in the fight, which added to the Spanish losses, now totaling 269. Days later, an English captive escaped and informed Oglethorpe of a rift among Spanish troops from Cuba and St. Augustine. Sensing an opportunity, Oglethorpe planned a surprise night attack on one of the encampments, hoping to capitalize on his familiarity with the land. However, just as his forces approached the camp, a Frenchman in his ranks fired his musket and deserted to the Spanish, betraying their position. Realizing his plans were compromised, Oglethorpe withdrew, but devised a clever ruse to undermine the deserters. Credibility. He wrote a letter to the Frenchman, feigning instructions to urge the Spanish to attack Frederica immediately, assuring them that the town was vulnerable. Oglethorpe suggested that if the Spanish hesitated, reinforcements would soon arrive, including 2,000 soldiers and 6 British warships. Oglethorpe gave this letter to a captured Spanish soldier, who, in exchange for freedom and a small reward, agreed to deliver it covertly. The letter reached the Spanish commander, who, interpreting it as a deliberate ploy, placed the French deserter in irons and called a council to debate their next move. Some officers argued that the letter was a trick to delay their attack, while others felt its details were too convincing to ignore, believing that Oglethorpe genuinely wanted to delay them. In the midst of their deliberation, 3 small Carolina ships appeared on the horizon, aligning with Oglethorpe's fictional reinforcements and reinforcing Spanish doubts about their strategy. Deciding to preempt any British support, the Spanish moved to attack Frederica directly. However, their advance was met by Captain Noble Jones and a small force of regulars and Creek warriors, who ambushed a Spanish scouting party, capturing prisoners and confirming the Spanish advance. With this information, Oglethorpe dispatched Captain Dunbar and a company of grenadiers to set up an ambush near a marsh. The Spanish, unaware, halted close by, stacking their arms and preparing camp. But a horse, startled by the sight of Oglethorpe's hidden soldiers, gave an alarm, prompting the Spanish to grab their weapons. Before they could organize, Oglethorpe's men unleashed a deadly volley, felling many Spanish soldiers before they fled, abandoning supplies and equipment. Oglethorpe's reinforcements under Major Horton joined the pursuit, adding to the confusion and disarray as the Spanish retreated, firing haphazardly and leaving a trail of casualties in their wake. The marsh, steeped in blood from the skirmish, earned the enduring name Bloody Marsh. Defeated and demoralized, the Spanish withdrew on July 14th, burning structures on the south ends of St. Simon's and Jekyll Islands before setting sail. Oglethorpe, determined to ensure their retreat, followed close behind, safeguarding Georgia's southern borders. This decisive victory underscored Oglethorpe's tactical prowess and the resilience of his small force, securing the colony against an imposing adversary and reinforcing the colony's strength and unity. At daybreak, a formidable line of 28 Spanish ships appeared near Fort William, where Ensign Stewart and his garrison prepared to defend. 14 of these vessels advanced into the harbor, demanding the fort's surrender. Stewart's reply was resolute. He would neither surrender the fort nor allow it to be taken. The Spanish launched an assault from their galleys, attempting to land troops, but a swift reinforcement of Rangers, arriving after a forced march, repelled the attackers. Despite Stewart's small force of just 60 men, he held Fort William with remarkable bravery, and after a grueling 3-hour skirmish, the Spanish forces retreated upon spotting Oglethorpe's approach. Their withdrawal left 2 galleys disabled and abandoned, as the Spanish governor shifted his troops inland. Stewart's valor earned him a promotion, and Georgia was saved from the brink of destruction by this tenacious defense. Despite spending over 2 weeks on St. Simon's Island, Don Manuel de Montillano had gained no ground against Oglethorpe's smaller force. The Spanish commander suffered significant losses in several skirmishes without inflicting comparable damage on Oglethorpe's troops. Upon his return to Havana, Montillano faced arrest, a court-martial, and was ultimately dismissed in disgrace, his failure seen as a stain on the Spanish campaign. In South Carolina, where the choice not to support Georgia had been divisive, some magnanimous figures openly lauded Oglethorpe's courage and strategic acumen, while others remained critical. The South Carolinian authorities themselves, however, refrained from commenting. Governors from other colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, sent Oglethorpe letters of gratitude, commending his skill and thanking Providence for placing the fate of the southern colonies in his hands. Still, his success drew its share of envy. Lieutenant Colonel Cook, one of Oglethorpe's accusers, leveled 19 charges against him, rallying certain officers and citizens to testify against the general. Unwilling to let these attacks stain his reputation, Oglethorpe traveled to England in 1743. A court-martial was convened, with days spent examining the charges. After careful deliberation, the court dismissed every accusation as baseless, and Oglethorpe's honorable acquittal was reported directly to the king. As a consequence, Lieutenant Colonel Cook was discharged from service, deemed unfit for any military post. Oglethorpe never returned to Georgia, but remained a committed advocate for its welfare. Until then, the colony had operated under a military government led by Oglethorpe and his appointed officers. With his departure, the trustees established a civilian government, appointing a president and 4 councils accountable to the trustees. William Stevens assumed the role of president, ushering in a new phase of governance for the young colony. Thus ends this chapter in early Georgian history. Amidst the struggle for survival, pivotal moments emerged, such as the failed assassination attempt against Oglethorpe, whose leadership would prove critical in repelling the Spanish invasion. The Creek Indians, crucial allies of the Georgian settlers, offered support where South Carolina abstained, highlighting the complexity of early colonial alliances. In keeping with our mission, we bring you narratives like these, stories preserved in the pages of old books, untainted by modern bias, written by people who lived the hardships of the time. Your contributions help us continue uncovering and sharing these invaluable historical accounts. Until next time, stay with us here, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.